There is one agency preventing mass starvation in Gaza at the moment. That is UNRWA. Britain has just cut off funding to UNRWA on the basis of unevidenced claims made by Israel. My source tells me that David Cameron made the choice to suspend funding without making an independent investigation of Israeli claims. One of the things I simply don't understand is why countries like Britain were so ready to believe what the Israelis told them. Israel has a record of telling whoppers. Israeli Defense Force and Israeli politicians have persistently, and as a matter of course, lied about what they are doing. And in the Gaza conflict, you can just think about the 40 beheaded babies and the Shifa Hospital, the great underground complex which Hamas was supposed to have there. They lied about the use of white phosphorus. They've lied again and again and fabricated fake episodes in order to substantiate their fake stories. Truth is the first casualty of war. Channel 4 News read the UNRWA report and pointed out that in that report there is no evidence to back up the Israeli claims. The Channel 4 report therefore raised really significant questions about why Britain, Australia, the United States and other countries withdrew their funds at once. You have to note the timing. So the ICJ comes out with its devastating ruling. A day later, suddenly, Israel produces this dossier about alleged links between UNRWA and Hamas. It's very convenient, and certainly if you look at the media coverage of the ICJ, a lot of the British media pretty well ignored the ICJ coverage, but immediately jumped on to these allegations against UNRWA. So very quickly, UNRWA is the story, not the ICJ ruling. UNRWA is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. It's there to look after Palestinian refugees. Israeli politicians have wanted to disband UNRWA for years.
אונר"א הוא ארגון שמנציח את בעיית הפליטים הפלסטינים, והוא גם מנציח את הנרטיב של זכות השיבה כביכול במטרה לחסל את מדינת ישראל. ולכן אונר"א צריך לעבור מן העולם.
Because UNRWA formalizes the idea that there are Palestinian refugees and they have a right to return, to go back to the homes which they were driven out of in many cases. And that's disliked by Israel because it has never accepted the right to return and would love to abolish the idea that somehow there are a collection of refugees who have the right of return. So that's led over time to a series of attacks or criticisms of UNRWA. Israel's Channel 12 exposed a classified, very high-level foreign ministry secret report which set out a three-stage plan to get UNRWA out of Gaza and get rid of UNRWA. And let's put this in a broader context. Britain, the United States, and other Western countries have been giving effectively a blank political check to Netanyahu and his semi-fascist government to commit atrocities on a massive scale without complaint, continuing to supply arms. At the same time, cutting off the funding for the one humanitarian agency which is able to give some form of relief to the people of Gaza, many of whom are starving. Let's bear in mind something else. More than 150 UNRWA staff have been killed by Israeli action. Not a single murmur of protest from the British government. You know, when David Cameron returned as Foreign Secretary, I was sort of cheered up.
Everybody knows that we're not going to sort out the problem of the Middle East peace process while there is effectively this giant open prison in Gaza.
I felt that he understood something about what Gaza is like.
Gaza cannot and must not be allowed to remain a prison camp.
He does know, and yet Cameron has continued to support the killing, the atrocities, and yet he feels it's okay to strip some of the most desperate people on this planet of what meagre support they are getting at the moment. But it's not just Cameron. Let's look at the case of Andrew Mitchell, who was International Development Secretary under the Cameron government 15 years ago. When Cast Lead happened, which was a relatively small percentage of what's going on now, he was really agitated by it. He called for an international arms embargo because what Israel was doing was so terrible. Christopher Gunnis, who was the head of UNRWA at the time, broke down crying after the Israelis shelled a UN school and killing staff and children they were responsible for.
The rights of Palestinians, even their children, are wholesale denied, and it's appalling. My pleasure.
That was 10 years ago, but nothing appears to have changed. Nothing's been done in the interim, and the same people are still around. David Cameron was Prime Minister then, he's Foreign Secretary now. Andrew Mitchell is part of the Cameron machine in the British Foreign Office. What's happened to Andrew Mitchell? What's happened to David Cameron, who once called Gaza an open-air prison? What is it puts them in this morally derelict position? I know both these people quite well, and they shame Britain, actually. They shame the West. They shame the Conservative Party, and they brought disgrace on themselves. If you go back 21 years, you have the young David Cameron voting naively for the invasion of Iraq on the basis of Tony Blair's fabricated dossier alleging Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, now called the Dodgy dossier. 21 years later, you have David Cameron acting with incredible promptitude. He cuts off the funding for UNRWA on the basis of this Israeli report. It does bring home the fact that the Iraq invasion was an utter disaster. It was based on fake information. Nobody involved in that business have suffered as a result. Their careers, they've continued to rise effortlessly upwards. Meanwhile, those who opposed the war, it needs to be said, have suffered for it. Jeremy Corbyn, been right about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and the one political voice, really, who speaks out for a ceasefire in Gaza, is absolutely marginalised, despised. You are rewarded in British politics for getting it wrong, and the consequences for believing dodgy dossier is actually your career continues to go upwards. Normally, when there are really difficult questions to be asked of a government in this kind of crisis, it's the job of the leader of the opposition to stand up in the House of Commons and ask the deadly questions. Why didn't you make the right checks? Why did you believe Israel without having an independent investigation? Unfortunately, the leader of the opposition is Keir Starmer, who doesn't ask the difficult questions. He has joined forces with Rishi Sunak and David Cameron to have a monolithic bloc at the heart of power about British policy towards Israel and Gaza. It's very hard to see any hope in this situation, but if there is one faint element of hope, is that the narrative put out by the State of Israel, the Conservative government, the Labour opposition, isn't true. And there's a different truth, and people are beginning, I think, to understand that. One of the reasons why Israel is able to carry on committing the atrocities it's doing in Gaza is because the world media, or at any rate the West media, is silent or complicit and certainly does not ask the difficult questions. And that's why Double Down News is so important. And you should support Double Down on Patreon and read Middle East Eye, which I write for.